Why do we like stories? Yes, they entertain us, but there's something deeper. Not only do they help us make sense of ourselves, but they also help us make sense of the world around us, which is quite a funny thought, really, given that most stories are based in complete and utter fantasies. Not. Think about it. You'll be sitting on your couch, eating away at a bag of chips, and you'll watch this little chicken have a panic attack to a fish, a duck with buck teeth, and a pig in a cardigan, all while they're about to get abducted by a UFO, and you'll sit back and think, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Not only that, you'll probably sympathize with that little chicken. See, there's something to be said about the subjective interpretation that we all take from these stories and then apply to our own lives that becomes more real than anything we really know. This fascinated me. I mean, what is it about these stories that since the dawn of humanity, whether they're religious stories, mythological stories, or stories about a chicken crying out that the sky is fallen, have piqued our interest, served as these blankets of comfort, and inspired our lives? Well, in 1990, a man by the name of Joseph Campbell answered that very question when he wrote a book called The Hero's Journey. In this book, Mr. Campbell summarized that the reason we're so encapsulated by these stories and these characters is because it's all the same story. It's our story, the human story, the constant cyclical battle between peaks and troughs to the narrative that is our own lives is what ultimately ends up bringing meaning to our lives. It beckons our very own kind of hero's journey. See, we need this journey. We don't operate well in a perpetual state of stagnation. It's anxiety-inducing. See, I believe much of today's mental health crisis is predicated on this idea that the ultimate goal of our lives is to be happy, and that we need to be happy all the time, and if we're not, then there's something wrong with us. But happiness is only a byproduct of other emotions, no? It's only there because of anger, sadness, grief, guilt, etc. It's not something real or tangible to be aiming towards. It only exists in the broad picture of an even bigger story. Think about a pirate looking for treasure. His life is grounded in this framework of meaning. He's on this adventure. Knowing so makes every hardship in his way that much more digestible. Whether it's the storms, the enemy ships, or sharks, he's able to withstand it all because his suffering is justified in something greater. Rather, if he was aiming towards nothing, even the smallest gust of wind would knock him over and send him crying back to shore. It's his adventure that's satiating. It's his adventure that makes him who he is. Many neurologists today agree that dopamine is elicited in the pursuit of a thing rather than that thing itself. Some psychologists even say consciousness is a route in generating the predictability of a world unknown, a map from getting from point A to point B. The point is, we all need a story. I think I got that across. But just like in any good story, there has to be a dragon to slay. Yet in our ever-so-changing worlds, riddled with the utmost complexity, always going 100 miles per hour, it's oftentimes that we lose sight of what we find important, and even more often that we lose sight of what we fear. But it isn't until we understand what we fear that we can begin to face those fears and conquer our own stories. People will do anything, even the most absurd things, to avoid facing their own souls. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a personal core fear of mine and how you can begin to find yours also. Over the course of the past 18 years, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, has had a pretty tight grip on my life and who I am. Now, at times, it can be quite difficult to explain to people who don't have OCD what the condition really entails. Most people understand the Hollywood version and see it merely as a collection of quirks that make someone overly meticulous, clean, or organized. But the unfortunate truth is that OCD is a far more complex issue. To give you an example of what I mean, I'll share with you the first obsession I ever had. I was in the 4th grade, riding the bus on the way to school, as most of us do, when I overheard some of the older kids talk about this new superhero movie that just came out called The Dark Knight. They were talking about how the actor who played the Joker in the movie became so immersed into his character that it actually ended up consuming him to the point where he couldn't shake the character from his head, and because of it, he took his own life. Now today I know that isn't true, but at the time it was a pretty scary thought for any 9-year-old to hear, and for some reason it struck me a bit deeper. I spent the rest of that day pacing around the playground, pacing around the hallways at school, because for some reason, this image had harbored itself deep in my mind. Months passed and I could barely sleep. I couldn't eat, I couldn't socialize. All I saw and all I could think about was this image right here. I started engaging in certain ritualistic behaviors like tapping things a certain amount of time, saying certain phrases, pacing around my house, hoping that somehow it helped dislodge this image. But nothing really worked. Things got so bad that I hid every hanger in my room and threw away every belt because I thought that if I thought about the Joker as much as that actor supposedly did, then I too would have no choice but to take my own life. Now, it wasn't until later that I learned that this was just a form of OCD, called suicidal ideation OCD. You see, I don't share this story out of sympathy or to cast myself as some sort of victim. No, I share this story because someone listening might have the same one. They just don't know the title yet. OCD, you see, has this reoccurring theme. It latches on to what you value most and casts you as the antagonist of its fictitious narrative. It tricks you into thinking that the only way to get rid of these obsessions, urges, impulses, images, whatever it may be, is to give in to the compulsory action of its desire, which ultimately ends up strengthening the cycle of anxiety even more. To put it simply, anxiety occurs from the inability to control some aspect of our lives. When things go right, it means one thing. When they go wrong, it can mean a billion different things. Your TV works, you can watch TV. Your TV doesn't work, someone forgot to pay the cable bill, there's a power line out, there could be an alien invasion, literally anything is possible. To me, anxiety is best represented by the question, what? While OCD is best represented by the question, what if? It's a more aggravated way of dealing with uncertainty. Ultimately, though, everything comes down to knowledge and education. I'd imagine you have a sore throat. You don't know what it is or why it's there, so you start to worry. So you go see a doctor, and you receive a diagnosis of, let's say, strep. And then, for some odd reason, even though when you swallow, it still feels like razor blades, you have this weight that's been lifted off your shoulders. The only difference now is you now have a diagnosis and therefore a prescription to deal with that diagnosis. Ever since I received my diagnosis, I've had the opportunity to employ a plethora of prescriptions to help combat my OCD, some more helpful than others. Yet, in a recent session with my therapist, shout out my therapist, I had the opportunity to employ a new prescription, this one called the Core Fears exercise, an exercise that would, well, I guess it's self-explanatory by nature, that'll help uncover your core fear. Dun, dun, dun. I'm sorry, I couldn't get the sound effects, but I think this hamster gets the point across. But in all seriousness, as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you most seek. Now, you start this exercise by writing down any anxiety-provoking thought or issue. No matter how big or how small, as long as it causes you some palpable sense of anxiety, you write it down. And then you ask yourself, if that thought or that issue were to be true, what is the absolute worst outcome that could come from it? The worst situation. Once you have that answer, you write it down. And then you keep asking yourself that very same worst-case scenario question, and what you'll find is that you're traveling down the rabbit hole to your core fear. Now, I know that might seem a bit confusing, so to clarify the process, I'll give an example of my own. As an actor and screenwriter, I'll do this the best way I know how, and that's through a story. We've all heard of this story, yes? Yes, thank you. I'll start by referencing a recent anxiety-provoking issue of mine, which was smelling cigarette smoke. I literally walked down the street, smelt cigarette smoke, and got anxious. It was that trivial. This initial anxiety-provoking issue, just like Alice first discovering the rabbit hole to Wonderland, is still based on some surface of reality, right? We haven't gone irrational just yet. Keep in mind, as I continue to ask myself these worst possible scenario questions, that these are tailored to my personal anxieties and my fears. Yours will likely look completely different. And if not, let me know. We can grab a coffee or something after this. All right, so we said the initial anxious thought was smelling cigarette smoke. So if I said, all right, Sina, what is the absolute worst possible situation that can come from you smelling cigarette smoke? Well, I think maybe my lungs and body won't be as ideal. They'll be damaged, okay? See, now we've begun following the rabbit down the irrational rabbit hole. What is the absolute worst possible situation that can come if your lungs and your body are damaged? Well, I think maybe I won't be able to perform as good as an actor. Okay, let's say that's true. What's the absolute worst possible situation that can come from that? Well, then I'll never be a successful actor. Okay, let's say you'll never become a successful actor. What is the worst possible situation that can come if you're not a successful actor? Well, I think I lose my sense of purpose. Okay, let's say you lose your sense of purpose. What's the worst possible outcome? Well, I think life will have no meaning and I'll end up taking my own life. Okay? And let's say life has no meaning and I end up taking my own life. What's the worst possible thing that can come from that? Well, I think that I failed myself. I have regret. Now, when you can't ask yourself any more questions, you've reached your core fear and you've taken a seat right next to Alice at the mad tea party. Here's the thing. People with anxiety disorders like OCD or anyone that gets in highly stressful situations finds it hard to gradually escalate their reactions. They take a minor concern and think the worst case scenario. It's like they walk in to watch some animated kids movie and react like it's a slasher horror film. This reaction is simply a common cognitive distortion known as catastrophizing. That all being said, I think it's important to acknowledge that we all have this hierarchy of things we value. Things that, because of how important they are to us, influence every conscious and subconscious decision we make. Now, much of what we value actually stems from what our cultures value. Each culture is like this complex game of its own with specific rules, regulations, and ways of winning said game. Who here has heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment before? Great, thank you. Well, for those of you that haven't, in this experiment, a simple coin toss determined whether a volunteer would be a prisoner or a guard for the duration of this fake prison simulation. What ended up happening surprised everyone. These so-called guards and these so-called prisoners instantly conformed to their fabricated social roles. Their behaviors adapted and their values changed, and not for the better. They actually had to terminate the experiment early. And although in recent years this experiment has received certain ethical and factual criticisms, I believe the weight of its conclusions still hold true. That whatever innate or intrinsic personality it is that you have that you think makes you, you, is actually no match for the weight that our environments and our cultures have on who we are, what we fear, and what we value. But people love to tell you what they value, don't they? They'll say it's their God, their family, their friends, their cat. But in my experience, you don't judge what someone values based off what they say. You judge what someone values based off what they do. And more importantly, what they fear. Like, I love to stand up here and tell you all about the purity of my values. But I'd just be lying to you. According to my core fear, what I value most is some form of self-actualized success. Now, my anxiety knows I value this, but our anxieties and OCD are really just flawed protection mechanisms, right? They don't intend to hurt us, rather protect us and keep us in line with whatever it is we value most, even if that means misinterpreting smelling cigarette smoke as some indication of self-failure. But by uncovering your core fear, you become more aware of this protective-like trick that your anxiety is trying to play on you. By becoming more aware of this trick, you're able to start seeing your anxiety for what it actually means rather than what it is on the surface. In every other scenario of our lives, we're hardwired to understand what something means, not what it is. You don't see a red light as a bunch of flickering LED bulbs. No, you see it and respond based on its meaning, to stop. You don't see a shopping cart and think, oh great, a metal apparatus with 4 wheels. No, you see a shopping cart and think, oh great, I don't have to carry the groceries inside. That's why you can watch a little animated chicken use a soda bottle as a jetpack and completely understand it. The same goes for our fears. I didn't smell cigarette smoke, get anxious, and think I must have a fear of smogs of tobacco. No, by uncovering my core fear, I was able to apply meaning to the true reason I was feeling anxious, therefore beginning to tackle my fear head on. Now, I do want to take a second to acknowledge the weight of this exercise. When I first did it, it brought me to tears of joy, really. By working through the choreography of each irrational thought, I was able to find my anxiety's most powerful move and strike it at its Achilles heel. So you have to understand that your core fear has always been there and will always be there. Acknowledging its presence doesn't give more substance. By engaging in this exercise, you simply uncover what's been happening subconsciously all along. These kinds of things still elicit an emotional response from us because they haven't been articulated yet. Emotions are just words that haven't been said. Yet still, people have this presumption that when exposed to what they fear most, it will somehow cause them to feel more fear or more anxiety. But quite the opposite is true. Our brains recognize these fearful situations in a somewhat mechanical manner, set us up to learn from them. Activity in our amygdala, which processes fear, decreases, while the prefrontal cortex, which helps regulate emotion, becomes more active. It's like, have you ever woke up in the middle of the night to take a pee or grab a glass of water? It's pitch black. You see nothing. You're grabbing at the bedside, at the countertop, anything to get yourself through. But What happens just a few short seconds later? Your eyes adjust. Today, I have a tattoo of the Joker on my left thigh. The Dark Knight is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I hope to one day play the character. When exposed, we actually become braver. We slay our dragon. But can you really slay your dragon if you don't know where it is? No tree, it is said, can grow into heaven unless its roots first touch down into hell. Carl Jung. Thank you.